Do you remember when and how you first encountered the theory of intersectionality, and sort of what was your reaction to it at that time?
Yes, so I attended Bard College as an undergraduate, and I was doing what was called a senior project, which is the equivalent of an honors thesis, and I was doing it on feminist rape law reform and studying the work of Catherine McKinnon. And so probably my junior and senior year, I came across the work of people like Audre Lorde and Angela Davis, but also very importantly Kimberly Crenshaw. And that was the first time that I began to think about different ways that communities of women are positioned regarding to social location, what we call social location now, which was called intersectionality. So I was introduced to it very early as an undergraduate, and then that left a deep impression on, I think, my intellectual imagination. And so when I went on to graduate school, I was very clear that I wanted to continue studying not only issues of feminist understandings of the law, but also placing women's experiences in the center of political analysis and looking at different communities of women.
What motivated you to do the relatively recent 2009 reader, The Intersectional Approach, and then did anything come out of doing that volume that you didn't expect going into it?
Right, so I hope when people read this book they really savor it, because it took Kathleen and I about 10 years to produce this book. So coming out of, Kathleen is a sociologist, my co-editor, and I'm a political scientist and do work in women's studies. We both tried to utilize intersectional theories in our dissertation. Our home disciplines did not have much guidance or help for us at that time. So we came out of that experience in graduate school knowing we wanted to think about not so much the why of intersectionality. So there was already a lot of work about why we'd want to use it, but really thinking about, as interdisciplinary social scientists, the how. And so what we talk about in the intersectional approach is really to think about how feminist intersectional theories can be somewhat operationalized. And I don't mean that in a reductive way, but thinking about how do you train people in geography, how do you train people in political science, how do you train people in sociology to really broadly, empirically demonstrate areas around intersectionality. So that motivated us to think about doing a reader, and then within that sort of thinking about really creating a place to celebrate and take stock of that this intersectional work started in women's studies, and it started with activist work as well as theorizing, and so wanting to document that as a shift, and also looking at how through women's studies this interest in intersectionality is, we argue, transforming other disciplines. We're surprised, I think, by the way in which people talked about the backlash, at least initially, from other activists and also other theorists. So this idea that if you use intersectionality, it's going to make gender, for example, wash out, right? If you focus on all of these different areas, it's going to make something fall away. And so we were surprised that some of the early founders of intersectionality, so we were able to talk to Michele Fine and Kimberly Crenshaw and Nira Yuval Davis, talked a bit about that. The other thing that was a really wonderful surprise to us was to push back on the idea that somehow intersectional work looks a certain way in terms of people doing the research. So we have a section called methodological innovations, and we feature people from a variety of disciplines, but in particular doing quantitative work and showing people that intersectionality is not too complicated to be thought of in terms of quantitative social science work. Part of why we did this collection is to show the ways in which intersectionality is being applied, and you see a lot of disciplines grappling with both the why and the how of intersectionality. And so in psychology, people are thinking about, well, how do we think differently about doing certain kinds of quantitative work? In philosophy, for example, people are thinking about various kinds of ethical demands that are placed on someone who wants to do this kind of work. I don't see the proliferation, let's say, of different ways of thinking about intersectionality as a problem. Sometimes it's been cast in the literature as a problem. I would say you're going to see, what we talk about in the book is thinking about intersectionality as this border-crossing concept, right? So if you look at the work of people like Carol Pateman's in The Sexual Contract, if you look at the work of Patricia Collins talking about the outsider within, those are concepts that began in a kind of gendered, feminist scholarship that then are being applied very differently across different disciplines. So I actually don't see a problem with a range of how people talk about it. I think when you get into what are the consistent ways in which people develop analyses is where the more interesting work, I think, is happening. Some scholars who are doing intersectional work, particularly in social work, public health, the health professions, nursing, are using it to talk about social change around racial and health disparities as one example. My work is doing work around HIV. I believe that that it creates a way for scholars to broaden their vision about the impact of their work, and that's I think a very different framework for us as scholars. Sometimes I hear from graduate students and other folk that it feels the process can feel so incomplete and therefore frustrating, and I sympathize with that, but I don't necessarily see that as something that would make us want to sort of not do it, right? So even if it feels that they're not attending to all of these things, there's still a lot to be gained by really kind of contesting the way in which structures of inequality have existed, both at a lived experience as well as the kind of interaction of these social structures in larger macro systems.